I think one area that a lot of listeners and readers might not be familiar with, because there is such a, I don't want to call it a revision, but there is such a sort of niche, I guess, in historical literature around the Civil War. And you document pretty well, like the atrocities that the United States committed on the frontier, and specifically people who were ostensibly fighting for the Union Army. That's an element that is largely ignored, but it's structured by this previous history of when there were debates and clashes and conflict around whether or not a state would be a free state or a slave state. The question was always assumed that, well, it was, we're just going to form this territory and then a state out of indigenous territory in the first place. And you don't often see that discussion kind of preceding the even the discussions around abolition or the expansion of chattel slavery. And I guess, what do you want readers to take away specifically from that Civil War moment? Because it does seem, I can just think off the top of my head, and the things that you named in this book is like, you have the U.S. Dakota War, of 1862. You have the Navajo Long Walk. You have, a lot of wars against the Apache people in the Southwest. There's stuff going on with Comanche. So why is it important that mainstream society and broader society understands the Civil War in this particular way through an indigenous lens?
There are probably two things that I would want. I think it's chapter 8, Collapse and Total War, about the Civil War era in the indigenous West. There are two kind of primary takeaways that I think we would be well served kind of identifying largely about the Civil War era. The first is that the Civil War was not just fought across the American West, but largely involved indigenous combatants. Other than the Battle of Glorieta, there were very few chapters or theaters of the Civil War between the North and the South and Confederate and Union forces outside of Missouri or west of Missouri. But there are tens of thousands of Indians who are fighting and dying. And this is partly because these conflicts were, as you were indicating, percolating and often erupting before the crisis itself. And particularly in a place like California, where state militias had been targeting indigenous peoples since the early 1850s and getting funding from the territorial and then state government. I don't know if actually the territorial government officially funded them, but they've certainly encouraged it. So the territorial, then state, and then federal government starts funding state militias essentially to kill Indians who have been, periodically taking their cattle or marauding their camps at night, or, very small scale, relatively, crimes, if we want to use that word, or kind of grievances, were precipitated this just incredible organization of violence against Native peoples, particularly in Northern California and the Sierra Highlands, in places like Humboldt County, or and I'm drawing on other people's findings. But so the war is fought across the West, California, the Dakotas, or the Dakota War, Sand Creek, the Bear River, the Long Walk. Many of the kind of most kind of familiar massacres of Indians occurred during the war era. And why is that? So, there's some kind of contemplation of this. I don't really kind of maybe theorize this as much as one could, but essentially because of the absence of the federal government, various state militias and then later Union leaders are essentially stationed in Western Indian agencies or territories without the kind of requisite structure or engagement, and they kind of develop their own kind of almost like cultures of vigilantism, where they feel it's their responsibility to go kill these Indians and punish them for stealing settler horses or something. So it's an incredibly violent, there's this whole chapter of the Owens Valley that I didn't really understand until I wrote that chapter, which is part of, it's on the border of Nevada and California. And so there's like, all these kind of chapters and theaters of conflict. There's also a more familiar conflict between the Cherokee. Basically, a civil war within the Civil War is occurring across the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokee and many other 5 civilized tribe members do join the Confederacy, in part because the Confederacy has forced them to abrogate their treaties with the federal government and swear allegiance to the Confederacy. And many, I think Stan Wadey is the last Confederate general to surrender, and he's a Cherokee leader. And so there's a kind of incredible kind of chapter within a civil war within the Civil War occurring among the Cherokee. So all that violence is also occurring in the West. It's not commensurate with the level of life lost in the East, of course, but it's still nonetheless occurring. And perhaps equally important, it's tied to what comes next, which is the growth of the federal government's authority during and after the war in ways that is really kind of lost in the kind of current study of the Civil War and Reconstruction. The federal government adds so many new states and during and after the war that it radically reconfigures the kind of structure of the national government. And all of a sudden, there's a kind of permanent, almost a Republican majority that begins just passing new laws and doing all kinds of things that create a kind of incredible kind of chaos throughout the post-war era, where you simultaneously have kind of continued treaty negotiations in the 1860s that have some of the most important treaty ever entered into by Native nations and the federal government, but that are subsequently followed by new congressional laws that abrogate and radically undercut them, among the Lakota perhaps most famously. So how can we make sense of this? Outside of a understanding that the West is an undetermined space both before, during, and after the war, and its ultimate determination as an incorporative space within the Union is fueled not by conventions of federal Indian treaty making or Indian lawmaking, but by a new form of congressional oversight that essentially gives Congress the power to do whatever it wants throughout the late 19th century, which will include allotment, religious persecution, child removal, and all the kind of onerous forms of assimilation. So these are all kind of part of a similar historical development that we often teach separately, the tribal history, the reservation era. But if we see them in kind of a slightly a larger frame, it's, I always kind of try to remind myself, if not others, that people live through each of these eras. You could have been like a teenager, in 1850, lived through the Civil War, experienced the growth of the federal government, experienced the reservation era, then saw maybe your children taken to boarding schools and your land's a lot. You could have lived through all this yourself. But as academics, we teach it as a kind of history of segmented or separated subjects, with the Civil War often forming like the crucible or the kind of midterm of American history, when in fact there's a lot of continuity throughout it.